Behind the Oscar-winning glamour of this acclaimed drama lies a web of fabricated memoirs, explosive political scandals, bitter feuds between literary giants, and one of the most controversial Academy Award speeches in history that sparked death threats and forever changed Hollywood. Fact 1. The entire story was likely fabricated. One of the most shocking revelations about Julia is that the entire story Lillian Hellman told in her memoir was almost certainly made up from beginning to end. The 1977 film was based on a chapter from Hellman's book called Pentimento, which she claimed was a true account of her dangerous mission to smuggle money to her childhood friend Julia, who was fighting the Nazis in Austria during the 1930s. For years after the movie's release, people accepted Hellman's story as fact, and the film even won 3 Academy Awards, partly because audiences believed they were watching real events unfold on screen. But then investigators and literary critics started digging deeper into the details, and what they found was absolutely stunning. Nearly every verifiable incident in Hellman's account turned out to be false or completely unconvincing. The most damning evidence came when a psychiatrist named Muriel Gardner stepped forward in 1983 with her own memoir called Codename Mary. Gardner's real-life story was almost identical to the fictional Julia's biography that Hellman had described. Like the character Julia, Gardner was a wealthy American who attended Oxford University, then went to Vienna to study medicine and underwent analysis with famous doctors. She also became deeply involved in anti-fascist underground work during the same time period that Hellman claimed her friend Julia was active. The similarities were so striking that it became virtually impossible to believe they were just coincidence. What made the situation even more suspicious was that Hellman and Gardner had never actually met in person, but they shared the same lawyer, Wolf Schwabacher, who had access to Gardner's personal stories and memoirs years before Hellman wrote her version. Fact 2. Meryl Streep's disastrous film debut. What's now considered one of the greatest actresses of all time had such a terrible first movie experience that she almost quit acting in films altogether. Meryl Streep was just 28 years old when she landed a small role in Julia, marking her very first appearance in a major Hollywood production, but the entire experience turned into a complete disaster that left her questioning whether she wanted to continue working in movies. Streep had been hired to play a character named Anne Marie, a gossipy socialite who was supposed to be a friend of the main characters Lillian and Julia. The filmmakers originally shot several scenes with her, giving her what seemed like a meaningful supporting role in the story. However, when the final version of the movie was put together in the editing room, almost all of her scenes ended up getting cut out completely, leaving her with barely 1 minute of total screen time in the finished film. But the problems didn't stop there, because what little footage of Streep that did make it into the movie was handled very poorly by the production team. They gave her what she later described as a terrible black wig that looked completely unnatural, and then they made things even worse by taking dialogue she had spoken in one scene and dubbing it over her mouth in a completely different scene, which created an awkward mismatch between what viewers could see and what they could hear. When Streep finally saw herself on the big screen, she was absolutely horrified by the result, and later said, "I had a bad wig and they took the words from the scene I shot with Jane and put them in my mouth in a different scene. I thought, I've made a terrible mistake, no more movies. I hate this business." Fortunately for movie fans around the world, Jane Fonda encouraged her to keep trying, and Streep went on to become one of the most celebrated actresses in film history. Fact 3. The director called Hellman a phony. The veteran director who brought Julia to life on screen eventually came to despise the woman whose story he was telling, calling her one of the most dishonest people he had ever worked with in Hollywood. Fred Zinnemann was a highly respected filmmaker who had directed classics like High Noon and From Here to Eternity, and he was known for being diplomatic and professional with everyone he worked with, which makes his brutal assessment of Lillian Hellman all the more shocking. When Zinnemann first agreed to direct Julia, he believed he was making a film about real events that had happened to Hellman during the 1930s, and he approached the project with the serious tone and careful attention to historical detail that such a true story deserved. However, as production continued and he spent more time working directly with Hellman on the script and the portrayal of her life, the director began to have serious doubts about whether anything she was telling him had actually happened. The situation became so bad that Zinnemann later gave a surprisingly harsh interview where he didn't hold back his feelings about the playwright at all. He said that Hellman believed she owned half the Spanish Civil War, while Hemingway owned the other half, and that she would portray herself in situations that were not true. But the most damning part of his statement came when he called her an extremely talented, brilliant writer, but she was a phony character, I'm sorry to say. The director went even further, revealing just how personal their conflict had become by admitting that my relations with her were very guarded and ended in pure hatred. This was an extraordinary public statement for a director to make about someone whose life story he had just spent months bringing to the screen. And it showed just how deeply Zinnemann felt betrayed by discovering that the supposedly true events he was filming were likely completely fabricated. Fact 4. Jane Fonda was originally cast as Julia. The casting process for Julia involved a major last-minute switch that completely changed which actress would play which character, and it happened because the producers were having an unexpectedly difficult time finding someone to play the lead role of Lillian Hellman. When the project first began development, Jane Fonda was actually signed on to play the title character Julia, the mysterious anti-fascist activist who becomes the focus of the entire story, rather than the playwright Lillian Hellman, who was supposed to be the main character telling the story. This original casting decision made a lot of sense at the time, because Julia was portrayed as a glamorous and idealistic young woman who fights against the Nazis in Austria, which seemed like a perfect fit for Fonda's image as a beautiful and politically active actress. However, as the producers continued their search for someone to play Lillian Hellman, they kept running into problems finding an actress who could convincingly portray the tough, chain-smoking playwright who was supposed to be the narrator and central figure of the entire film. The casting difficulties became so serious that the producers eventually decided to make a dramatic change to their entire approach, and they asked Jane Fonda if she would be willing to switch roles and play Lillian Hellman instead of Julia. This meant they now needed to find a completely different actress to play the title character, which led them to approach Vanessa Redgrave for the role of Julia, even though both actresses were known for their controversial political views. Interestingly, during the original casting process, both Fonda and Redgrave had been mentioned as possible stars for the film, but the studio's publicity department had initially advised against hiring either of them because of their outspoken political beliefs. The irony is that the producers ended up casting both actresses anyway, creating exactly the politically charged combination that their own publicity team had warned them to avoid. Fact 5. Studios feared political controversy from casting. The executives at 20th Century Fox were so worried about the potential political backlash from casting certain actresses that their own publicity department actually tried to block both of the film's eventual stars from being hired for the project. This behind-the-scenes drama shows just how nervous Hollywood studios were in the 1970s about working with actors who had controversial political views, especially when it came to issues involving war and international conflicts. Jane Fonda had already created a massive controversy just a few years earlier when she visited North Vietnam during the Vietnam War and was photographed sitting on an anti-aircraft gun, which earned her the nickname Hanoi Jane and made her one of the most polarizing figures in America. Many people considered her actions unpatriotic and even treasonous, and conservative groups had organized boycotts of her movies as a result. Meanwhile, Vanessa Redgrave was known for her support of various left-wing political causes and her outspoken criticism of American foreign policy, which had also made her a target of criticism from conservative audiences. When the names of both actresses came up during casting discussions for Julia, the studio's publicity department became genuinely panicked about the potential consequences of hiring them for the same film. According to insider accounts, the publicity experts told the producers that the absolute worst possible scenario would be to cast both Fonda and Redgrave together in the same movie, because their combined political reputations would create a public relations nightmare that could destroy the film's chances at the box office. Despite these serious warnings from their own publicity team, The producers ultimately decided to ignore the advice and cast both actresses anyway, apparently believing that their acting abilities were more important than their political controversies. As it turned out, the film became both a critical and commercial success, proving that the publicity department's fears were largely unfounded. Fact 6. Vanessa Redgrave's Oscar speech caused death threats. What should have been one of the most celebratory moments of Vanessa Redgrave's career instead turned into one of the most dangerous nights in Academy Awards history, with security measures that had never been seen before at the ceremony. When Redgrave won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her role in Julia at the 1978 ceremony, she used her acceptance speech to make a highly controversial political statement that immediately created chaos, both inside and outside the theater. The trouble had actually started weeks before the ceremony, when members of an extremist group called the Jewish Defense League began making serious threats against Redgrave and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. These threats were so credible and so violent that the Academy was forced to implement unprecedented security measures for the entire event, including positioning trained snipers on the roof of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion to watch for potential attackers during the live television broadcast. When Redgrave took the stage to accept her award, she thanked the Academy for standing firm and refusing to be intimidated, and then she delivered the explosive statement that made the situation even worse. She told the audience that they had refused to be intimidated by the threats of a small bunch of Zionist hoodlums whose behavior is an insult to the stature of Jews all over the world. The phrase Zionist hoodlums immediately caused gasps and boos from the audience, and it escalated the already dangerous situation to an entirely new level. The consequences of her speech were severe and long-lasting, with bomb threats continuing to pour in for months afterward. The violence wasn't just theoretical either, because a member of the Jewish Defense League was later arrested and convicted for actually bombing a theater in Los Angeles that had been showing Redgrave's pro-Palestinian documentary called The Palestinian, proving just how real the danger had been all along. Fact 7. The JDL burned Redgrave in effigy. The controversy surrounding Vanessa Redgrave's Oscar nomination for Julia became so intense that an extremist organization actually created a life-size dummy representing the actress and set it on fire in public demonstrations, while also placing what amounted to a price on her head. The Jewish Defense League, which was led by Rabbi Meir Kahane, had become furious with Redgrave not just because of her role in Julia, but because she had also produced and narrated a documentary film called The Palestinian during the exact same year that Julia was released. This documentary was extremely controversial because it presented a sympathetic view of the Palestine Liberation Organization and included an interview with PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, in which he stated that the only solution to the Middle East conflict was what he called the liquidation of the apartheid state of Israel. When the interviewer asked Redgrave if she agreed with this statement, she responded with a simple, "Certainly," which created an enormous backlash from Jewish organizations and pro-Israel groups across America. The Jewish Defense League's response to Redgrave's documentary and her subsequent Oscar nomination was both dramatic and frightening, as they organized public demonstrations where they burned effigies of the actress while chanting slogans and carrying signs that read, "Redgrave and Arafat, a perfect love affair." But their actions went far beyond symbolic protests, because they also issued what was essentially a bounty, offering money to anyone who would take violent action against Redgrave. The situation became so dangerous that Redgrave required constant security protection, and the threats were taken seriously enough that law enforcement agencies had to treat them as credible risks to her safety. The Jewish Defense League also organized picket lines outside theaters that were showing The Palestinian, and they successfully pressured some venues to cancel screenings of the documentary due to fears about potential violence from protesters. Fact 8. The $2.5 million literary lawsuit. A single comment made during a television interview turned into one of the most expensive and bitter legal battles in American literary history, lasting for years and destroying the friendship between two of the country's most prominent female writers. In January 1980, Mary McCarthy appeared as a guest on The Dick Cavett Show on PBS. And when the host asked her which writers she thought were overrated, McCarthy mentioned several names including Lillian Hellman, calling her tremendously overrated, a bad writer, and a dishonest writer. When Cavett pressed her to explain what she meant by calling Hellman dishonest, McCarthy delivered what became one of the most famous literary insults of all time, saying that every word she writes is a lie, including and the. This devastating comment was broadcast to a national television audience, and it immediately created a sensation in literary circles across the country, with people either laughing at the cleverness of the insult or gasping at how cruel it was. Lillian Hellman was absolutely furious when she learned about McCarthy's televised attack, and she decided to respond not with words but with legal action, filing a defamation lawsuit for the enormous sum of $2.5 million against McCarthy, Dick Cavett, and the public broadcasting system. This was an astronomical amount of money for a libel case at the time, and it showed just how seriously Hellman took the damage to her reputation. The lawsuit became a major news story that fascinated the public and divided the literary world into camps, supporting either Hellman or McCarthy. Even famous writers like Norman Mailer tried to mediate the dispute by publishing an open letter in the New York Times, but his efforts were unsuccessful. The case dragged on for years, consuming enormous amounts of time, money, and emotional energy from both writers, and it was still ongoing when Hellman died in 1984. Fact 9. Jason Robards won for only 5 minutes. One of the most remarkable achievements in Academy Awards history happened when Jason Robards won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, despite having what may be the shortest amount of screen time ever for a winning performance in that category. Robards played the famous mystery writer Dashiell Hammett, who was Lillian Hellman's real-life mentor and romantic partner, but his total appearance in the entire 2-hour film lasted approximately only 5 minutes from beginning to end. What makes this Oscar win even more extraordinary is that Robards managed to create such a memorable and impactful portrayal of Hammett in those brief moments that Academy voters felt he deserved recognition over actors who had much larger roles in their respective films. His performance consisted mainly of a few key scenes where he appears as the gruff, chain-smoking, hard-drinking writer who serves as both Hellman's literary guide and her emotional anchor throughout the story, but he disappears from the movie for long stretches at a time. The 5-minute performance included moments where Hammett encourages Hellman with her writing, shows concern about her dangerous mission to smuggle money into Nazi Germany, and provides the kind of steady, masculine support that helps ground her character during the most dramatic parts of the story. Robards brought such authenticity and depth to these limited scenes that he completely captured the essence of the real Dashiell Hammett, the author of famous detective novels like The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man. This Oscar win was actually Robards' second consecutive Best Supporting Actor award, as he had won the previous year for his role in All the President's Men, making him one of the few actors to win back-to-back Oscars in the same category. The fact that he achieved this rare double victory while appearing for such a brief time in Julia demonstrates just how powerful his screen presence was and how effectively he could make every moment count. Fact 10. Zinnemann offered Julia role to Streep. Meryl Streep came incredibly close to landing one of the most important roles in the entire film, which would have completely changed the trajectory of her early career and possibly made her a major movie star years earlier than she actually became. During the pre-production phase of Julia, director Fred Zinnemann was actively looking for an unknown actress to play the title character, and he had been specifically searching for fresh talent rather than established Hollywood stars for this crucial role. Zinnemann had attended a performance of Shakespeare in the Park in New York City, where he saw a young stage actress named Meryl Streep performing in one of the outdoor productions that were popular with theater audiences during the summer months. The director was immediately impressed by Streep's powerful stage presence and her ability to completely transform herself into the character she was playing, which made him think she might be perfect for the mysterious and idealistic Julia. The opportunity for Streep to play Julia arose when Vanessa Redgrave began having serious doubts about the script and was considering withdrawing from the project altogether due to concerns about how her character was being written, developed. This created a major crisis for the production team, because they had already built their entire casting plan around having Redgrave in the title role, and losing her would have meant starting the search process all over again from the beginning. When it became clear that Redgrave might actually drop out, Zinnemann remembered the impressive young actress he had seen in Shakespeare in the Park, and he decided to offer the role of Julia to Meryl Streep instead. However, before Streep could accept or decline the offer, Redgrave ultimately decided to stay with the project after the script issues were resolved to her satisfaction, which meant that Streep ended up with only the small supporting role that eventually got cut down to almost nothing in the final version of the film. Fact 11. The real Julia never existed. When investigative journalists began checking the specific details that Lillian Hellman had provided about Julia's death and burial, they discovered that virtually every verifiable fact in her story was completely false, proving that the entire tragic ending of the memoir was fabricated. According to Hellman's account in Pentimento, after Julia was murdered by Nazi agents in Frankfurt, her body was sent to a specific funeral home in London, where Hellman claimed she had traveled to claim the remains and arrange for proper burial. However, when researchers tried to verify this emotional and dramatic part of the story, they found that the funeral home Hellman had named in her memoir simply did not exist, and had never existed at that location in London. This was not a case of a business that had closed down or moved to a different address over the years, but rather a complete fabrication of a place that had never been real in the first place, which immediately raised serious questions about the accuracy of everything else in Hellman's account. The investigation became even more damaging when researchers decided to check the travel records that would have documented Hellman's supposed trip to England to retrieve Julia's body. Hellman had been very specific in her memoir about which ship she had taken for this transatlantic crossing, providing the exact name of the vessel and the dates of her journey, which should have made it easy to verify her story using official passenger manifests and shipping company records. But when investigators looked up these transportation records, they found absolutely no evidence that Lillian Hellman had ever sailed to England on the ship she claimed to have taken during the time period she specified or at any other time around those dates. This discovery was particularly devastating because it meant that not only had Hellman invented the funeral home, but she had also fabricated her entire heroic journey to recover her friend's body, which was supposed to be one of the most emotionally powerful and personally meaningful parts of the entire story. Fact 12. Hellman wrote it wasn't fiction. Even as the movie was going into production, Lillian Hellman was still adamantly insisting to everyone involved that her story about Julia was completely true, and that the filmmakers needed to treat it as a factual account rather than a work of imagination. On June 30th, 1976, just as the cameras were about to start rolling, Hellman sent a letter to the film's producer that contained a very specific and forceful statement about the nature of her story that would later seem incredibly ironic given what investigators would eventually discover. In this letter, Hellman wrote that this is not a work of fiction and certain laws have to be followed for that reason, which was her way of telling the production team that they had legal obligations to be careful about how they portrayed real people and real events. This statement was significant because it showed that Hellman was not only lying to the general public about the truth of her memoir, but she was also actively deceiving the Hollywood professionals who were spending millions of dollars to bring her supposedly true story to the screen. The fact that Hellman felt the need to emphasize the non-fictional nature of her story in writing suggests that some people involved with the production may have already been expressing doubts about whether the events she described had actually happened the way she claimed. Her insistence on the legal implications of treating the story as fact also indicates that she understood how serious it would be if the filmmakers discovered that she had been lying to them about such fundamental aspects of the project. This written statement became particularly damaging to Hellman's reputation years later, when researchers began proving that virtually every detail of the Julia story was fabricated, because it showed that she had not only invented the story for her memoir, but had also deliberately misled an entire film production team about the truthfulness of the material they were adapting for the screen. Fact 13. The smallest Oscar-winning screen time. Vanessa Redgrave achieved something that very few actors have ever accomplished in Academy Awards history. when she won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for a performance that lasted only about 10 minutes in the entire 2-hour film, making her victory one of the most efficient acting triumphs ever recorded. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that the character of Julia is supposedly the central figure of the entire story, yet Redgrave appears on screen for such a brief amount of time that many viewers don't even realize how little they actually see of her throughout the movie. The structure of the film meant that most of Julia's presence was felt through flashbacks to childhood scenes where she was played by a different actress, or through Jane Fonda's character talking about her and remembering their friendship, rather than through direct scenes featuring Redgrave herself. When Redgrave does appear as the adult Julia, she's often bandaged and injured from her anti-fascist activities, or she's participating in brief, tension-filled encounters where she has to speak in hushed tones because of the dangerous political situation surrounding her character. The most important scene featuring Redgrave takes place in a Berlin cafe, where she meets with Lillian Hellman's character to receive the money that has been smuggled across the border, and this single sequence was considered so powerful and emotionally effective that many people believe it was what won her the Academy Award. During this crucial scene, Redgrave had to convey years of friendship, political passion, personal sacrifice, and impending tragedy all through subtle facial expressions and carefully delivered dialogue. Since the characters couldn't speak freely due to the constant threat of Nazi surveillance, film critics and Oscar analysts have often pointed to Redgrave's win as proof that the Academy sometimes rewards pure acting skill and emotional impact over the quantity of screen time, because her brief but intensely memorable performance managed to capture the essence of her character so completely that voters felt she deserved recognition despite her limited appearance in the film. Fact 14. Explosive political protests at the Oscars. The 1978 Academy Awards ceremony turned into one of the most politically charged events in Oscar history, with angry protesters from opposing sides creating a chaotic scene outside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion that threatened to overshadow the actual awards show taking place inside. The demonstrations were so intense and so well organized that police had to work overtime to keep the two groups of protesters separated and prevent the situation from turning violent on live television. On one side of the conflict, members of the Jewish Defense League had organized a massive protest against Vanessa Redgrave's nomination, carrying signs with messages like "Redgrave and Arafat," "A Perfect Love Affair," and "Hell No to Vanessa Redgrave and the PLO," which were designed to highlight what they saw as her inappropriate support for Palestinian causes. The JDL protesters were furious about Redgrave's documentary The Palestinian and her public statements supporting the Palestine Liberation Organization, and they wanted to make sure that everyone attending the ceremony understood their opposition to her potential victory. But the Jewish Defense League demonstrators weren't the only ones making their voices heard that night, because a competing group of pro-Palestinian supporters had also shown up to defend Redgrave and counter the negative messages being directed at her. These supporters carried their own signs with messages like "Vanessa, a woman of conscience and courage," and they positioned themselves in direct opposition to the JDL protesters, creating a tense standoff between the two groups throughout the evening. What made this situation particularly unusual for an Academy Awards ceremony was that the television cameras were carefully positioned to avoid showing any of the protests to the viewing audience at home, which meant that millions of people watching the broadcast had no idea about the political chaos that was happening just outside the theater. The police and security teams worked hard to keep both groups of demonstrators away from the main entrance areas where celebrities were arriving, ensuring that the red carpet arrivals could proceed normally despite the heated political confrontations taking place nearby. Fact 15. Host Bob Hope's sarcastic jab. When Jason Robards won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for Julia but failed to show up at the ceremony to accept his award, host Bob Hope delivered one of the most memorable and cutting one-liners in Academy Awards history that perfectly captured the awkwardness of the moment. Robards had simply decided not to attend the 1978 ceremony without giving any public explanation for his absence, which left the producers scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation when his name was announced as the winner. As the audience sat in confused silence waiting to see if Robards would eventually appear from somewhere in the theater, Bob Hope stepped up to the microphone and delivered a perfectly timed joke that got huge laughs from the crowd, while also making a pointed commentary about actors who had rejected their Oscar wins in previous years. Hope said that Robards must be off playing bridge with George C. Scott and Marlon Brando, which was his way of referencing two of the most famous cases of actors who had refused to accept their Academy Awards. The reference to George C. Scott was particularly relevant because Scott had famously refused his Best Actor Oscar for Patton in 1971, calling the entire awards process a meat parade and refusing to participate in what he saw as a meaningless competition between artists. Similarly, Marlon Brando had rejected his Best Actor Oscar for The Godfather in 1973, sending a Native American activist named Sachin Littlefeather to the ceremony in his place to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. Hope's joke was brilliant because it suggested that Robards was joining an exclusive club of serious actors who were too cool or too principled to bother showing up for their Oscar wins, even though there was no evidence that Robards had any political or artistic objections to receiving the award. The comment also helped to diffuse what could have been an embarrassing moment for the Academy by turning Robards' absence into a source of humor rather than confusion.